Please stay with me.
Emma Brooks whispered as she carried the bleeding little girl through the rain, her arms trembling and her uniform soaked through. She had just finished another night shift when she found the wrecked SUV, the driver dead, and 7-year-old Sophie barely breathing inside. Emma did not know the child's name. She did not know her father was Gabriel Moretti, the most feared Mafia boss in New York. She only knew a life was fading against her chest. At the hospital, Emma gave the rare blood Sophie needed, then disappeared before anyone could thank her. By morning, Gabriel stood beside his daughter's bed with one command: find the woman who saved her. Autumn rain had swallowed New York beneath a curtain of silver, turning the streets into black mirrors and blurring every traffic light into trembling streaks of red and green. It was nearly midnight when Emma Brooks stepped out of the food packing factory in Queens, pulling the hood of her faded coat over her damp brown hair. At 30, Emma was a plus-size woman with a soft, rounded face, warm hazel eyes, and pale skin that always seemed tired beneath the fluorescent lights of the night shift. Her body carried the weight of long hours, skipped meals, and years spent putting other people's needs before her own. Once, she had owned a small bakery, but debt and bad luck had taken it from her. Now she sealed boxes of frozen meals until 11:30 each night, then walked home to save bus fare, because every extra dollar went toward the nursing home where her mother lived with Alzheimer's disease. Emma had learned to move through the city quietly, unnoticed by almost everyone, and on most nights she preferred it that way. She was exhausted, her feet aching inside worn shoes, but her thoughts were not on herself. They were on the latest invoice from the nursing home and the possibility that she might have to accept another weekend shift. The intersection at 43rd Avenue was almost empty when the sound came. It was not the ordinary crash of two cars colliding, but a violent, metallic explosion that seemed to tear through the storm itself. Emma turned just in time to see a delivery truck slide sideways across the wet road, its rear wheels lifting as the driver fought uselessly for control. A black SUV entered the intersection from the opposite side, and the truck struck it directly in the passenger side, with enough force to send the vehicle rolling. The SUV turned once, then twice, shattering glass across the pavement before landing upside down against the curb. For several seconds, Emma could not move. Her breath locked in her chest, and the entire world seemed reduced to the hiss of rain on twisted metal. The truck had come to a stop farther down the street, its front crushed, while the SUV's horn blared continuously beneath the storm. A thin trail of smoke began curling from beneath the overturned vehicle. Emma knew what that could mean, and fear rose through her so sharply that her knees nearly failed her. She ran anyway. The driver of the SUV was a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, perhaps in his late 40s, with cropped grey hair and a scar across one cheek. Blood covered the side of his face, and the unnatural angle of his neck told Emma there was nothing she could do for him. Then she heard a sound from the back seat, so faint she almost mistook it for the rain. It was a child's broken breath. Emma dropped to her knees beside the shattered rear window and saw a little girl hanging upside down from her seatbelt. The child was about 7 years old, slender and small, dressed in a navy school coat over a white blouse, with long dark hair spilling toward the roof of the overturned car. Blood ran from a wound above her temple and disappeared into her hair. Her skin was frighteningly pale, and her lips had begun to turn blue. Emma reached inside, calling to her, but the girl did not respond. Smoke thickened near the front of the vehicle, and somewhere beneath the chassis, fuel dripped steadily onto the flooded street. Emma's hands began to shake, yet her mind became strangely clear. She wrapped her coat sleeve around her fist and struck the remaining glass until the window frame opened wide enough for her shoulders. Sharp fragments cut her knuckles, but she barely noticed. Crawling halfway into the vehicle, she held the girl's body with one arm and pulled at the seatbelt with the other. The buckle would not release. Emma remembered the small utility knife she carried at work to open boxes, found it in her pocket, and sawed through the thick strap while whispering that everything would be all right. though she had no idea whether that was true. The moment the belt snapped, the girl's weight fell into her arms. Emma dragged her carefully through the window, shielding the child's head against her chest, then staggered backward onto the road. A spark flashed beneath the hood. The sight of it erased every thought except escape. There was no ambulance in sight, and Emma's phone had been destroyed when it slipped from her pocket into the water near the wreck. She knew the nearest hospital was more than a kilometer away, beyond 3 long blocks and an elevated railway. The child was not breathing properly, and waiting beside the road felt impossible. Emma lifted the girl against her body and began to run. She was not built for speed, and after the first block, her lungs burned as though they were tearing apart. The child's blood soaked through Emma's uniform and warmed the skin beneath it. Each time Emma stumbled, she tightened her grip, terrified that one wrong movement might make the injuries worse. Cars slowed as she crossed intersections, but no one stopped long enough to understand what they were seeing. Emma kept going, driven by a single thought that repeated with every step. Not here. Not tonight. Not in my arms. By the time the bright emergency sign of St. Catherine's Medical Center appeared through the rain, her legs were trembling so badly she nearly collapsed at the entrance. The emergency doors opened and 2 nurses rushed toward her. One was a compact woman in her 50s named Linda Perez, with silver-streaked hair pulled tightly behind her head, and the calm, direct manner of someone who had spent decades making decisions under pressure. She caught the child, as Emma's strength finally gave way, and immediately began issuing orders. Doctors transferred the girl to a gurney, cut away her blood-soaked coat, and wheeled her toward the trauma unit, while Emma stood in the middle of the corridor, drenched and shaking. A young emergency physician, Dr. Daniel Hart, returned several minutes later. He was tall and lean, with tired blue eyes, short blonde hair, and the controlled expression of a man who had learned never to let fear reach his patients. He told Emma that the child had suffered severe blood loss and possible internal injuries. The hospital had identified her blood type as O negative, but their emergency supply was nearly exhausted after a multi-car accident earlier that evening. Emma stared through the glass doors at the small body surrounded by doctors, then asked one question. "Can you test me?" Her blood type was also O negative. Linda tried to explain that Emma was exhausted, injured, and already close to collapse. But Emma sat down in the donation chair before the nurse finished speaking. As the needle entered her arm, she looked at the blood staining her factory uniform and thought of her mother, who no longer always remembered her name, but still smiled whenever Emma brought warm bread to the nursing home. Emma wondered whether the little girl had a mother waiting somewhere, or a father who had no idea his entire world was lying behind those doors. The room spun slightly, yet she refused to close her eyes. When the donation was complete, the doctors carried the blood away immediately. The surgery lasted for hours. Emma remained in a plastic chair near the operating wing, wrapped in a hospital blanket, watching the clock move toward dawn. At last, Dr. Hart returned and told her the child had survived. The bleeding had been controlled, and although the next 24 hours would remain critical, she had a real chance. Emma closed her eyes and released a breath she felt she had been holding since the crash. She did not ask the child's name, and no one yet knew how to reach the family because the SUV's records were still being processed by the police. Before the morning shift filled the hospital with visitors, Emma changed into a set of borrowed scrubs, folded the blood-stained uniform into a bag, and slipped quietly through a side exit. She had no desire for gratitude, money, or recognition. In her mind, she had not done anything extraordinary. A child had needed help, and she had been the one standing there. By sunrise, she was back in her small apartment, too exhausted even to remove her wet shoes before falling asleep on the couch. Across Manhattan, Gabriel Moretti received the call at 6:17 in the morning. He was a tall, powerfully built man of 41, with sharp cheekbones, dark hair touched with grey at the temples, and a closely trimmed beard that made his expression appear even more severe. For years, people throughout New York had spoken his name with caution. He controlled ports, logistics companies, hotels, and real estate holdings, most of them now operating within the law, though the shadow of the Moretti empire still followed him everywhere. Since his wife's death 3 years earlier, Gabriel had become colder, more disciplined, and almost impossible to approach. Only his daughter Sophie could soften him. When the hospital director told him that Sophie was alive, Gabriel gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. Then he learned about the unknown woman who had pulled Sophie from the wreck, carried her through the storm, and donated the blood that kept her alive. Gabriel stood in silence for several seconds before turning to the 2 men waiting near the door. His voice was low, controlled, and final. "Find her. I want the woman who saved my daughter found, no matter what it takes." Gabriel Moretti did not believe in coincidence, and he trusted facts far more than rumors. By noon on the same day Sophie opened her eyes in the intensive care unit. Every security camera near the intersection had been reviewed, every witness interviewed, and every hospital employee questioned with absolute respect, but relentless precision. Within hours, the woman who had disappeared before sunrise was no longer anonymous. Her name was Emma Brooks. Gabriel studied the thin investigation folder in silence from behind the wide oak desk in his Manhattan office. The report described a 30-year-old former bakery owner who had declared bankruptcy 2 years earlier after rising ingredient costs and overwhelming debt forced her business to close. It listed her current employment as a night shift packaging worker at a food processing factory, and noted that nearly 70% of her income was transferred directly to a nursing home caring for her mother, Margaret Brooks. Margaret, 72, was a gentle, retired elementary school teacher whose advancing Alzheimer's disease had gradually erased most of her memories. Though according to the nurses, she never forgot that her daughter visited almost every day, carrying fresh flowers whenever she could afford them. Gabriel slowly closed the file. The woman who had saved his daughter possessed almost nothing, yet she had still given away the one thing another human being could not buy in time: her own blood. 3 days later, Emma finished visiting her mother before walking toward the nursing home's parking area. Margaret had smiled at her throughout the afternoon, although halfway through their conversation, she had suddenly asked whether Emma had finished her homework for school. Emma had smiled back without correcting her. Those moments no longer broke her heart the way they once had. They simply reminded her that love sometimes remained long after memory disappeared. As she stepped outside, she noticed several black luxury vehicles parked quietly beneath the autumn trees. Standing beside the first car was Gabriel Moretti. He looked exactly as newspapers occasionally described him, though the photographs never captured the calm authority surrounding him. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, beneath a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat. His dark hair was neatly combed, a few strands of grey at the temples, revealing years of responsibility rather than age, while his trimmed beard framed a face whose sharp angles suggested a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. 2 discreet bodyguards remained several steps behind him, alert but respectful enough not to interrupt the conversation unless necessary. Gabriel removed his leather gloves before speaking. Emma immediately recognized him from the television interviews that occasionally appeared whenever another Moretti company announced a new investment or charitable project. She understood exactly who stood before her, yet there was no fear in her expression. She simply looked surprised that one of the wealthiest and most influential men in New York had come personally to meet someone like her. Gabriel thanked her before saying anything else. His voice remained low and steady, carrying neither arrogance nor theatrical emotion. He explained that Sophie had survived because of Emma's courage, and because she had donated blood when there was almost none available. One of the bodyguards respectfully placed a black briefcase on the hood of the vehicle before stepping back again. Gabriel opened it himself. Inside rested neatly arranged bundles of cash, enough money to erase every debt Emma had ever known. He pushed the case gently toward her, without pressure. "Please accept this," he said. "No father could ever repay what you did, but I cannot allow your kindness to go unanswered." Emma stared at the money only briefly, before closing the briefcase herself and pushing it back toward Gabriel. Her response came without hesitation and without dramatic speeches. "I saved a child," she answered quietly. "If it had been any other child in that car, I would have done exactly the same thing." For a rare moment, Gabriel found himself speechless. Throughout his life, he had met politicians who praised him while expecting favors, executives who admired him while seeking contracts, and enemies who feared him because of his reputation. Almost everyone reacted to his name in some predictable way. Emma reacted only to the situation itself. She neither admired nor feared him. She simply judged the event according to her own conscience. Gabriel studied the sincerity in her tired, hazel eyes and understood that she truly believed what she had said. The realization earned something very few people ever received from him: genuine respect. He nodded once, accepted the refusal without argument, and wished her mother good health before leaving. Emma watched the convoy disappear through the gate, believing the encounter had ended forever. It had not. Gabriel returned to his office, carrying the unopened briefcase exactly as it had left. Instead of feeling offended, he found himself thinking about the quiet dignity with which Emma had refused a fortune that could have transformed her life overnight. That evening, he summoned his longtime legal advisor, Richard Lawson. Richard was a slender man in his early 60s, with silver hair, wire-framed glasses, and the patient habits of someone who had spent 4 decades solving problems before they reached a courtroom. He had advised Gabriel's late father, and had remained because he believed Gabriel genuinely intended to transform the family empire into legitimate business. Gabriel handed him Emma's file and gave only one instruction: no gifts she can return. Help her without asking for credit. Richard understood immediately. Every action would be completely legal, carefully documented, and impossible to trace back to Gabriel unless he chose to reveal it. Within a week, Margaret Brooks's nursing home administrator called Emma into the office. The administrator, Helen Morris, was a kind woman in her 50s, with soft features and calm brown eyes that often comforted anxious families before they even spoke. She informed Emma that an anonymous charitable medical foundation had paid every outstanding balance for Margaret's long-term care and guaranteed future treatment for the next several years. Emma sat frozen in her chair. She insisted there had to be a mistake, because no such foundation knew her family. Helen gently assured her the documents had been verified by attorneys, and the payments had already cleared. Emma left confused, but deeply relieved, believing perhaps someone connected to her mother's former teaching career had quietly stepped forward. Strange things continued happening. One afternoon, she returned home to discover construction workers repairing water damage that had existed for years. The broken heating system was replaced before winter arrived. The dangerously loose apartment stair railing was reinforced. A locksmith installed stronger deadbolts, while technicians mounted discreet security cameras outside the entrance, under the explanation that the building owner had approved a safety upgrade. Emma questioned the landlord, who seemed equally surprised, except for mentioning that an investor had unexpectedly financed improvements throughout the aging property. Days later, when she finished another exhausting night shift, she discovered a compact silver sedan, legally registered in her name, parked outside the building. Attached to the keys was only a handwritten card reading, "No one should have to walk home alone after midnight." There was no signature. Emma did not need long to connect the impossible sequence of events. After several determined phone calls and a visit to the law office that had handled the nursing home payment, she finally uncovered the truth. Every anonymous donation, every repair, every security improvement, and even the small, reliable car had originated from companies quietly linked to Gabriel Moretti. The next afternoon, she requested another meeting. Gabriel welcomed her into one of his corporate offices overlooking the Hudson River, expecting perhaps a simple thank you. Instead, Emma placed the car keys on his desk. Her usually gentle voice carried unmistakable frustration. She explained that kindness did not give anyone permission to rearrange another person's life without consent. She appreciated his gratitude, but she wanted the right to stand on her own feet, even if those feet sometimes walked home in the rain. Gabriel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he inclined his head respectfully. "If that is your wish," he replied, "I will stop." Emma believed him, because she had no reason not to. After she left, Gabriel remained standing beside the window until the elevator carrying her reached the lobby. Then he pressed a single button on the secure phone resting on his desk. The man who entered several moments later was Marco De Luca, the 45-year-old director of Moretti Security. Marco was broad-chested, heavily built, with close-cropped black hair, a neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper beard, and the quiet discipline of a former Marine officer who had spent most of his adult life protecting other people. Years earlier, he had failed to prevent an assassination attempt that claimed Gabriel's wife, a failure he had never forgiven himself for, despite Gabriel never blaming him. That loss had transformed Marco into someone who trusted preparation more than optimism. Gabriel handed him Emma's file once again. "She believes I've stopped," he said quietly. "Let her believe that. But from today forward, she is never alone. Rotate plainclothes teams, keep your distance, and make sure she never knows you're there." Marco accepted the folder without asking questions. Gabriel looked once more toward the city beyond the glass, his expression growing colder as old instincts returned. He knew better than anyone that the moment his enemies discovered who had saved Sophie Moretti's life, Emma Brooks would become far more than a grateful father's concern. She would become a target. Gabriel's instincts proved correct before the week was over. The rival organization that had ordered the attack on Sophie's vehicle had expected the crash to end quietly, leaving Gabriel Moretti grieving and vulnerable. When hospital records confirmed that the child had survived, their attention shifted to the unknown woman who had carried her from the wreck. Traffic cameras revealed Emma crossing the intersection with Sophie in her arms, while a compromised hospital employee quietly supplied the time of the blood donation and the address listed on Emma's identification. By the time Marco De Luca's security team discovered the leak, 2 unfamiliar cars had already begun appearing near Emma's apartment. The men inside never approached her directly. They watched from a distance, changed license plates, and disappeared whenever patrol vehicles passed. Marco understood the pattern immediately. They were not preparing a robbery. They were studying her routine. Emma remained unaware of the danger until the night it finally reached her. She had just finished another long shift at the food factory and was walking toward the compact silver car Gabriel had given her, though she still intended to return it as soon as she could arrange reliable transportation of her own. The parking lot behind the factory was narrow and poorly lit, surrounded by chain-link fencing and rows of silent delivery trailers. Rainwater from the previous evening had collected in shallow potholes, reflecting the orange security lamps above the loading docks. Emma had nearly reached the driver's door when 3 men stepped from between 2 parked trucks. They wore dark hooded jackets and inexpensive masks, giving the appearance of ordinary street thieves, but their movements were too controlled and coordinated. The tallest man approached from the front, while the other 2 spread out to block both exits. He demanded her purse and keys in a harsh voice, yet his eyes never looked at the items in her hands. They remained fixed on her face, measuring her reaction. Emma's body stiffened as fear moved through her. She had been robbed once, years earlier, outside her bakery, and that frightened teenager had grabbed money and fled within seconds. These men were different. One carried plastic restraints beneath his sleeve, and another kept glancing toward an unmarked van waiting near the rear gate. Emma understood with sudden, chilling certainty that they did not want her wallet. They wanted her. She stepped backward and tightened her grip on the keys, forcing herself to remain calm despite the pounding in her chest. When the tallest man lunged forward, Emma swung her metal lunch container at his face and tried to run. She managed only several steps before one of the others seized the back of her coat. The fabric tore at the shoulder, and Emma fell hard against the wet pavement. A hand closed around her wrist, while another man reached for her mouth. The first gunshot struck the asphalt several feet away, deliberately placed as a warning. The kidnappers froze. Headlights flooded the parking lot as two dark vehicles accelerated through separate entrances, blocking the van and cutting off every escape route. Marco emerged from the first car, with 4 plainclothes guards moving behind him. He wore a dark wool coat over body armor, and his broad frame appeared even larger beneath the harsh security lights. The years he had spent as a Marine had trained him to control violence rather than display it, and his voice remained unnervingly calm as he ordered the men to release Emma. One kidnapper reached inside his jacket. Marco crossed the distance before the weapon cleared the fabric, twisting the man's arm and forcing him to the ground. The remaining guards subdued the others with the same efficient discipline. The entire confrontation lasted less than a minute, yet to Emma, it felt suspended outside time. She remained on the pavement, breathing rapidly, staring at the strangers who had appeared from nowhere to save her. Marco crouched several feet away, rather than touching her without permission. He introduced himself and explained that Gabriel had assigned protection after the hospital leak was discovered. Emma's fear quickly turned into anger. Gabriel had promised to stop interfering, yet his men had continued watching her every movement. She demanded to know how long they had followed her, and whether they had also watched her visits to her mother. Marco answered honestly. His team had protected both locations, but had never entered private spaces or listened to personal conversations. Before Emma could respond, another vehicle entered the lot. Gabriel stepped out before the driver had fully stopped, his normally controlled expression fractured by a flash of alarm when he saw Emma sitting on the ground with her coat torn. He crossed the lot quickly, but like Marco, he stopped before reaching for her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Emma wanted to accuse him of breaking his word, yet the sight of the restraints lying beside one of the captured men silenced her. She finally understood that Gabriel's secrecy had not been driven by pride or a desire to control her. It had been driven by fear. The interrogation of the kidnappers confirmed what Gabriel already suspected. The men had been hired to take Emma alive and use her to force access to Sophie. By dawn, Gabriel had made a decision that Emma immediately rejected. Remote protection was no longer sufficient. He wanted her moved to the Moretti estate, where the roads, gates, cameras, and staff were all controlled by people he trusted. Emma refused to abandon her apartment and insisted that she would not live like a prisoner because of enemies she had never chosen. Gabriel did not argue about her own safety. Instead, he placed a photograph of Margaret's nursing home on the table between them and explained that the same people who had traced Emma could easily trace her mother. The realization struck harder than the attack itself. Emma could accept danger directed at her, but she could not gamble with the life of a woman who no longer understood enough to protect herself. By that afternoon, arrangements were made for Margaret to move temporarily into a private medical suite on the Moretti property, supervised by qualified nurses. Emma agreed to come only because her mother would be safer there. The estate stood behind stone walls on the northern edge of the city, surrounded by autumn woods and guarded by discreet security posts hidden among the trees. It was not the dark fortress Emma had imagined, but a vast old mansion built of pale limestone, with wide windows, ivy-covered terraces, and gardens beginning to fade beneath the cooling weather. Inside, the halls were elegant but strangely quiet. The household manager, Mrs. Evelyn Hart, welcomed Emma with formal warmth. Evelyn was a tall woman in her late 50s, with silver blonde hair arranged in a neat knot, sharp grey eyes, and the composed manners of someone who had managed wealthy households for most of her life. Beneath her strict posture was a deeply protective nature, strengthened after she had helped raise Sophie following the death of Gabriel's wife. She showed Emma to a comfortable room near Margaret's medical suite and made it clear that Emma was a guest rather than an employee. No doors would be locked against her, and she would be free to leave once Gabriel determined it was safe. Sophie saw Emma the following morning. The little girl had returned home from the hospital several days earlier, but still moved carefully because of her healing injuries. A thin bandage remained above her temple, and shadows lingered beneath her large brown eyes. When she entered the breakfast room and recognized the woman from the brief moments she remembered after the crash, she stopped completely. Emma lowered herself slowly so she would not appear threatening. Before she could speak, Sophie crossed the room and wrapped both arms around her. The embrace was so sudden and desperate that Emma nearly lost her balance. Sophie whispered that she remembered Emma telling her not to be afraid while carrying her through the rain. Emma held the child gently and promised that she was safe now. From the doorway, Gabriel watched his daughter cling to someone she had known for only minutes, and he saw a trust Sophie had not offered anyone since the accident. The bond between them developed with unexpected ease. Every afternoon after school, Sophie ran through the entrance hall and searched for Emma before removing her coat. She began joining Emma in the kitchen, where Evelyn allowed them to use a small side counter for baking. Emma taught her how to knead bread without pressing too hard, and how to tell when butter was soft enough by touching it with one finger. Flour covered Sophie's dark hair, and her laughter gradually replaced the silence that had filled the mansion for 3 years. At night, when nightmares woke her with memories of shattered glass and an overturned car, Emma sat beside the bed and read stories until her breathing slowed. She never told Sophie to forget the accident. Instead, she helped the child describe what frightened her, then reminded her that surviving did not mean she had to be brave every moment. Gabriel often paused outside the bedroom and listened without entering, unwilling to interrupt the fragile peace Emma created. Weeks passed, and the changes in Sophie became impossible to ignore. She stopped refusing to travel by car and no longer panicked whenever tires screeched outside the estate gates. She began drawing again, filling pages with bakeries, rainbows, and 3 figures holding hands beneath a large yellow sun. Gabriel found himself returning home earlier from meetings, simply to hear the sound of his daughter laughing in the kitchen. One evening, he stood unseen near the doorway while Sophie decorated a misshapen cake with far too many strawberries. Emma pretended the result was perfect, and Sophie laughed so freely that Gabriel felt something inside him loosen after years of silence. He had believed his greatest debt to Emma was the blood she had given and the life she had physically saved. Watching Sophie smile, as she had before losing her mother, he finally understood the truth. Emma had not only rescued his daughter from a ruined vehicle, she was rescuing the part of Sophie's childhood that grief and violence had almost taken away. Life inside the Moretti estate had gradually settled into a rhythm that almost felt ordinary. Yet Emma began noticing small disturbances beneath its polished surface. Gabriel's business meetings often took place in a secured study on the eastern side of the mansion, where senior advisors reviewed shipping schedules, hotel acquisitions, and the final stages of converting old family operations into legitimate corporations. Emma was never invited into those discussions, nor did she attempt to listen. But the household changed whenever something important was being planned. Security teams rotated more frequently, cars arrived after dark, and Gabriel spent longer hours behind closed doors. Then, without fail, something went wrong. A warehouse inspection occurred hours before sensitive documents were moved. A rival crew appeared near a delivery route that only a handful of people knew. Once an entire shipment of medical supplies had to be redirected because armed men were waiting near the original distribution yard. Gabriel blamed surveillance, corrupt officials, or compromised communication systems. But Emma saw a simpler and more troubling pattern. The person who attracted her attention was Anthony Bellini, one of the oldest men in Gabriel's inner circle. Anthony was 58, tall but beginning to stoop slightly at the shoulders, with thinning iron-grey hair, a narrow face, and deep lines around his mouth that made him appear perpetually dissatisfied. He had served the Moretti family for more than 20 years, and had once been the closest advisor to Gabriel's father. Among the guards, he was treated with the respect normally reserved for family. Anthony rarely raised his voice, and often spoke with the measured patience of a man who believed his experience placed him above suspicion. He remembered Gabriel as a young man, had attended his wedding, and had stood beside him at his father's funeral. That history gave Anthony access that newer guards could never have earned. It also made Gabriel unwilling to examine him too closely. Emma first noticed Anthony's habit during a meeting concerning a logistics contract in New Jersey. Minutes before Gabriel left the study, Anthony stepped into the corridor and claimed he needed to answer a call from his doctor. The following day, a rival company attempted to interfere with the exact route discussed behind those doors. Several nights later, during preparations for a private meeting at one of Gabriel's hotels, Anthony again excused himself to make a phone call. The rival organization appeared near the hotel before Gabriel's convoy arrived. Emma began writing down the dates in a small notebook she normally used for bread recipes. She compared the timing of each incident, forcing herself to remain objective because accusing a trusted man without proof could destroy lives. The pattern remained unchanged. Whenever Anthony left a planning meeting alone, information leaked within hours. Emma finally brought the notebook to Gabriel one evening after Sophie had gone to bed. He read every page without interruption, his expression becoming increasingly distant. When Emma carefully explained her suspicion, Gabriel closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her. "Anthony protected my father for 2 decades, he said. He carried me out of a burning car when I was 19. He stood beside this family before most of the people in this house were born." Emma understood the loyalty behind his refusal, but she also understood how easily loyalty could become blindness. She did not accuse Anthony of betrayal again. Instead, she suggested a controlled test. Gabriel could give him a false shipment schedule, known to no one else. If the rival organization appeared at the fake location, the truth would no longer depend on suspicion. The idea was known in intelligence work as a canary trap, and Gabriel disliked it precisely because it might succeed. Still, the recent leaks threatened more than his companies. They threatened Sophie and everyone living under his protection. The following morning, he summoned Anthony privately and handed him a sealed schedule for a supposed transfer of valuable electronic cargo through an abandoned freight terminal in Brooklyn. Gabriel stressed that the route was confidential and that Anthony alone was responsible for coordinating security. In reality, no shipment existed. Marco quietly positioned armed teams throughout the terminal, while police contacts loyal to the federal investigation monitored nearby roads. Anthony accepted the envelope with his usual calm expression. Gabriel watched him leave with a heaviness he could not explain away. The rival crews arrived shortly after midnight. 3 vans approached the abandoned terminal without headlights, carrying men armed for an ambush. They expected a vulnerable convoy, and instead found every entrance blocked. Marco's teams emerged from concealed positions, surrounding the attackers before they could retreat. The confrontation ended quickly, with several men arrested and the others abandoning their vehicles. Gabriel remained in the command room, watching the surveillance feeds in silence. There was no triumph in his face when confirmation arrived. Only betrayal. Anthony's private room at the estate was searched immediately. Investigators discovered an encrypted phone hidden beneath a false drawer, along with offshore banking records documenting years of payments from the rival organization. The evidence proved that he had not betrayed Gabriel once. He had been selling Moretti information for years. Anthony understood what had happened before anyone confronted him. Instead of returning to the estate, he abandoned his car near a subway station and disappeared. Marco ordered every gate, hotel, warehouse, and family residence secured. Gabriel assumed Anthony would attempt to leave the city, but Anthony knew escape was impossible. His accounts were exposed, his contacts compromised, and every road out of New York would soon be monitored. Desperation drove him toward the only leverage he believed could still save him: Sophie Moretti. That afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn Hart asked Emma to collect Sophie from school because a medical appointment had delayed the usual driver. Emma arrived 20 minutes before dismissal at St. Catherine's Academy, a private elementary school housed in a red brick building surrounded by iron fencing. Parents gathered beneath the trees, chatting as teachers prepared the children for release. Emma saw Anthony near the entrance, wearing a tan coat and holding a visitor's badge. He had removed his usual earpiece and glasses, but she recognized the rigid way he held his shoulders. More importantly, Anthony never picked Sophie up from school. The moment his eyes met Emma's, the polite expression disappeared from his face. Emma did not hesitate. She entered the building, reached Sophie's classroom, and took the child's hand before the teacher completed the dismissal form. Sophie sensed the fear in Emma's grip and began asking questions, but Emma told her they were playing a quiet safety game. While guiding her toward a rear corridor, Emma used her phone inside her coat pocket to send Gabriel a live location and a single message. Anthony is here. Behind them, the front doors slammed open. Anthony had stopped pretending. He shouted Sophie's name and ordered Emma to wait. Emma pulled the child through a set of fire doors and locked them from the opposite side. She knew the lock would not hold long, so she rolled a heavy cleaning cart against the handles and dragged a second supply trolley beside it. Anthony struck the doors hard enough to shake the glass. Sophie began to cry, and Emma crouched beside her for only a second, promising that her father was coming. Then she took a fire extinguisher from the wall and moved them farther down the corridor. When Anthony forced the doors apart, Emma discharged the extinguisher directly into the opening. White powder filled the hallway, blinding him and forcing him backward. She led Sophie through the cafeteria, overturned a metal serving cart behind them, and locked another fire door before continuing toward the gymnasium. Anthony pursued them through the building, growing more furious each time Emma delayed him. She was terrified, but terror no longer controlled her movements. Every decision came from the same instinct that had carried Sophie through the rain weeks earlier. Keep the child alive. Nothing else mattered. Sirens and engines filled the school grounds only minutes later. Gabriel arrived with Marco and a full security team, entering through the front while police sealed the perimeter. They found Anthony near the gymnasium, trying to force open the final locked door. He reached beneath his coat, but Gabriel's men surrounded him before he could draw the weapon. Marco forced him to the floor and secured his hands behind his back. Anthony was taken alive. Sophie ran from the gym and threw herself into Gabriel's arms, while Emma stood nearby with white extinguisher powder covering her hair and coat. Her hands shook only after the danger had ended. Anthony's encrypted phone, financial records, and eventual confession exposed not only the men who had paid him, but also corrupt employees, compromised officials, hidden accounts, and the full structure of the rival organization. Years of betrayal unraveled within days, because Emma had noticed what everyone else had ignored. Gabriel listened to the reports, but his attention remained on the woman sitting beside Sophie in the estate library that night. Emma had once carried his daughter from a burning wreck and given her blood to keep her alive. Now she had faced a trusted traitor inside a school and protected Sophie until help arrived. Gabriel finally understood that Emma Brooks had saved his daughter for the second time. The weeks following Anthony Bellini's arrest changed New York, more quietly than anyone outside the investigation would ever realize. Anthony had spent years collecting information from inside the Moretti organization, but the encrypted files recovered from his devices revealed far more than one man's betrayal. Every payment, hidden account, coded message, and secret meeting formed a chain that stretched from corrupt businessmen to organized crime leaders who had believed themselves untouchable. Gabriel Moretti fulfilled the promise he had made years earlier when he first began transforming his family's empire into legitimate businesses. Instead of burying the evidence or seeking private revenge, he ordered every document to be delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the federal prosecutors already investigating organized corruption. The decision surprised many people who had once considered him incapable of trusting the law. Yet Gabriel no longer wished to preserve the old world that had taken his wife and nearly stolen his daughter. The empire his father had built through fear had already become something different, and now he intended to complete that transformation without compromise. Special Agent Michael Donovan soon became one of the most familiar faces entering the Moretti headquarters. Donovan was a 46-year-old FBI investigator with close-cropped brown hair, weathered features, and thoughtful gray eyes that reflected 2 decades spent dismantling criminal organizations. He possessed the calm patience of a man who preferred evidence over dramatic arrests. And although he had spent years investigating the Moretti family, he judged people by the choices they made, rather than by old reputations. Working beside him was Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Collins, a composed woman in her early 40s with dark skin, neatly braided black hair, and an unwavering reputation for prosecuting organized crime without political influence. She reviewed every document Gabriel surrendered, verified every financial transfer, and coordinated simultaneous warrants that reached warehouses, shell corporations, hidden storage facilities, and dozens of corrupt associates throughout the city. Within weeks, the rival organization that had orchestrated Sophie's assassination attempt ceased to exist. Their leaders were arrested, their financial network frozen, and the officials who had accepted bribes alongside them faced federal indictments. For the first time in many years, Gabriel looked at the skyline of New York without wondering which unseen enemy might already be planning the next attack. As the investigations concluded, another realization quietly settled over the Moretti estate. The extraordinary security measures that had surrounded Emma Brooks and her mother were no longer necessary. Margaret Brooks continued receiving excellent treatment until doctors confirmed that moving her back into familiar surroundings would benefit her emotionally. Emma spent several days preparing their small apartment before leaving the estate. Gabriel did not attempt to persuade her to stay. He understood that safety could never become another form of imprisonment, even when offered with the best intentions. On the morning of her departure, the household gathered near the front entrance. Sophie hugged Emma so tightly that neither wanted to let go, while Mrs. Evelyn Hart discreetly wiped tears from the corner of one eye before pretending to adjust Margaret's blanket. The mansion had become warmer because of Emma's presence, but everyone understood that true kindness sometimes meant allowing another person to choose their own path. Gabriel walked Emma to her car without bodyguards following behind them. The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across the long driveway, and for several moments neither of them spoke. Emma thanked him for protecting her mother and for giving both of them a chance to live without fear. Gabriel shook his head almost immediately, as though refusing to accept gratitude for something he considered obvious. He looked toward the sunlight filtering through the trees, before turning back to Emma. "You saved my daughter," he said quietly. "Not once." His voice paused for only a heartbeat before continuing. "Twice." Emma lowered her eyes, remembering the burning vehicle and the locked school corridor. But Gabriel continued before she could respond. "I will never force you to do anything. Not where to live, not where to work, not what kind of future to choose." There was no confession of love, and no dramatic promise that everything ahead would be easy. There was only respect, freely given between two people who had already changed each other's lives. Emma smiled softly, thanked him one final time, and drove away, with Margaret sleeping peacefully beside her. Returning to the old apartment felt strangely different. The walls had not changed, nor had the narrow staircase or the small kitchen overlooking the busy street below. Yet Emma herself had changed. For the first time in years, she carried no crushing medical debt, and no fear that violent strangers might appear outside her door. Instead of searching for another factory shift, she unlocked the dusty storefront where her bakery had once stood. The old ovens needed repairs, the shelves required fresh paint, and the faded sign above the entrance barely remained attached. But Emma no longer saw ruins. She saw another beginning. Former neighbors wandered inside to greet her, surprised that the quiet baker everyone had missed was finally returning. Margaret, though often confused, smiled whenever the smell of fresh bread filled the rooms, as though some memory beyond words still remained alive within her. Slowly, one loaf at a time, Emma rebuilt the dream she had once believed was gone forever. A year passed with remarkable peace. Gabriel officially completed the legal restructuring of every remaining Moretti enterprise, replacing the final shadows of the old organization with publicly accountable companies that employed thousands across New York. Newspapers now wrote about logistics expansions, hotel renovations, and charitable investments instead of violence and suspicion. Yet Gabriel's favorite destination each morning was not his corporate headquarters. It was a small neighborhood bakery where warm light spilled through the windows before sunrise. Almost every workday, he stopped there to buy fresh bread, though he rarely left with only what he had come for. Emma always insisted he try a new recipe, and their conversations drifted naturally from business to books, from Margaret's latest stories to Sophie's school projects. Neither of them attempted to define what had quietly grown between them. They simply allowed trust to continue becoming part of ordinary life. The bakery soon became Sophie's favorite place in the city. Every afternoon after school, the 7-year-old hurried through the familiar doorway with the same excitement she had once shown while running across the halls of the Moretti estate. She no longer carried the fear that had haunted her after the accident. Instead, she tied a small apron around her waist, climbed carefully onto the wooden step stool Emma had built especially for her, and proudly helped brush melted butter across warm bread or arrange pastries inside the display case. Customers smiled whenever they saw flour dusting Sophie's dark hair, while Emma laughed beside her. Gabriel often arrived just before closing time, pretending he needed another loaf of bread, even though everyone understood the real reason he came. The bakery had become something larger than a business. It had become the place where all three of them felt most like themselves. One golden autumn afternoon, as sunlight poured through the front windows and painted the wooden floor with long amber reflections, Emma carefully lifted a tray of fresh rolls from the oven, while Sophie stood beside her wearing oversized baking gloves. The little girl accepted the tray with exaggerated seriousness before setting it safely on the cooling rack. Then, without warning, she reached out and took Emma's hand with one small hand and Gabriel's with the other. Her smile carried the uncomplicated honesty that only children possess. She looked first at Emma, then at her father. "If Miss Emma hadn't saved me that day," she said softly, "I wouldn't be here anymore." She paused, squeezing both of their hands a little tighter before continuing. "Today, I only wish you will always stay beside me." Gabriel looked at Emma, and Emma looked back at him. Nothing more needed to be spoken, because some promises become stronger precisely when they remain unspoken. As evening settled over the neighborhood, the last customer waved goodbye, and Emma turned the sign on the bakery door from open to closed. Gabriel helped stack the chairs without being asked, while Sophie carefully switched off the display lights, exactly as Emma had taught her. Together they stepped outside, into the cool autumn air. The streets glowed beneath the orange light of sunset, and leaves drifted quietly across the sidewalk. No reporters waited nearby. No bodyguards surrounded them. No enemies watched from passing cars. Gabriel locked the bakery door. Emma slipped the keys into her pocket, and Sophie naturally walked between them, holding both of their hands. Without speaking another word, the three of them began walking slowly down the street toward the fading horizon, leaving behind not a fairy tale ending, but something far more enduring. The quiet beginning of a family that had chosen one another. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes he sends an ordinary person at exactly the right moment. Emma never had power, wealth, or influence, yet God placed her on one rainy street when a little girl needed her most. One act of courage changed 3 lives forever. Perhaps that is how miracles often happen, not through extraordinary people, but through ordinary hearts willing to choose kindness when it matters most. In our own lives, we may never know when someone is silently praying for help, or when God is giving us the chance to become the answer to that prayer. A single decision to help, to forgive, or to stand beside another person can create a future none of us could have imagined. Never underestimate the power of compassion, because what seems like a small act to you may become someone else's greatest blessing. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and share what part moved you the most. Your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your family and friends so more people can discover stories of faith, courage, and kindness. May God bless you, protect your family, fill your home with peace, and guide your steps wherever life leads you. Thank you for watching, and may His grace always be with you.